Well then, I guess this was bound to happen. Every time there is a big community event, a big reveal event from Blizzard regarding this game, there is going to be the inevitable aftermath of the community reactions, and many times people who are going to be happy with what is announced are just going to be chilling, not really, being vocal about the things they agree with, about the things they are satisfied with. What is going to happen is that there is going to be way more people that are going to be willing to voice their concern, to voice their displeasure, to voice their anger and their disappointment. And there have been a couple of statements here and there that have sparked some debate regarding the vision that Blizzard has towards the Shadowlands expansion going in the future. I would like to start with the first, more important statement, because this is going to affect player power. This is going to effectively, possibly change the way you play and the way you, entertain the activities in the game, which is scaling PvP gear. That is something that popped up later, I guess after BlizzCon. Not many people paid attention to it, and it was an answer regarding PvP gear. Essentially, it turns out that the developers have been talking about PvP relative item level for PvP gear, similar to what we had in Worlds of Draenor. The idea, of course, was going back to the old system where you would basically have items with 2 item levels. One is the base item level, which is very low, or, comparatively low, and then as soon as you enter PvP combat, whether it's arena or battleground or even open world content, your gear is going to scale up to be much better than what it is. It was pointed out at a couple of interviews for Icy Veins and Vanion, which is a German online site, and this could be very interesting because remember, one of the first things that Blizzard pointed out when talking about loot, gear, was that they were very happy with the PvP system. Right now, we just got confirmation that Mythic Plus is going to get an extra addition to their system, and we then also got confirmation at BlizzCon that raiding is going to get another help, another addition to the way and the availability of loot in raids. So technically, PvP was the only one that was just doing okay, but now we have a possibility. We have the consideration of going back to the scaling gear. This would, at the very least, raise the question of if they were okay with the way PvP loot was working, were they actually not saying the entire truth, which is it's okay as a system for PvP, but it is hurting too much the other activities of the game. So PvE in general, it is forcing too many PvE players to do PvP. Not only is it bad for PvE players because they might not want to do PvP, but also it might be bad for PvP players because then they are going to get much higher geared PvE players from Mythic raids, more generally, that can simply get a leg on them by having much higher gear. This system is the system that, of course, can fix the problem. You're going to have PvE players completely uninterested in PvP gear because they can no longer give them any help in PvE. Now they can get their normal higher item level from Mythic Plus, and then the even higher one from raids, and they no longer need the version from PvP. In Worlds of Draenor, the last time you had this system, the gear you were able to get with Conquest was basically the same level of Mythic gear. Back in WoD, bosses had, a variable item level, even more than now. You had the first 4 bosses dropping 720, the following 4 dropping 725, and then the following 4 dropping 730, with only Archimond dropping 735, and then you had the PvP gear that you get from Conquest, which would be default 700, and then scaling in PvP all the way up to 730. So the default was lower than Heroic, even the lower bosses of Heroic loot quality, and then the PvP version would be higher than any piece of Mythic gear except for Archimond. If we were to compare this, if we were to literally take this system and put it into Shadowlands, then pretty much all of the PvP gear would be at 207 to 210 item level, and then it would scale up to 226, roughly 226 in PvP content. This is very, clearly going to be not, sought after by PvE players because 207, 210 is quite low. They don't really need this after the first few weeks of heroic raiding, and then of course they don't really care if it is scaling all the way up to 226 in PvP because that is not what they are after. At first glance, this should be sort of like a pacifying system, right, for both factions, the PvP one and the PvE one. The PvP one will not get its horde of PvE invaders crashing into their game mode because they want loot, that's all they care about, as well as the PvE side of the affair won't feel or need to go into a different game mode, PvP, just because they want gear, because they also want the same thing when they go into PvP. One of the issues is that, as you might know, if you are a PvPer. Yes, the PvP acquisition system right now is very good because it allows you to get very high item level with rather good certainty just by getting at a certain rating and then just grinding the honor points you need. You can even target the item from a vendor, which is very good, very precious in an expansion where there is very little loot. It's much better, but the acquisition is rather slow. It's not that you can get full PvP gear very quickly. PvP gear is the best, but it is also the best as a sort of complementary way of gearing up. So if you're a Mythic Raider with PvP gear, you're going to have very high item level. If you are a Mythic Plus player with PvP gear, you're going to get good item level. If you're someone who just does PvP, you won't be gearing up as fast. So you also had this discrepancy where PvE players were also able to just outgear and outmuscle PvP players because they could simply gear faster. From the PvE side, they were doing plus the PvP side. This system is sort of going to, drive a pretty thick line between the two game modes. It's going to leave PvP gear for PvP players and PvE gear for PvE players. The current problem we have in this expansion for this system to be implemented well is the fact that you are currently looting, a few too little gear for this to work. Remember that PvE players have lamented a scarcity of loot, and this is with including players having to go into PvP to get some extra pieces of gear from the vendor. So if you were to basically remove the availability of PvP gear, you would have to also increase the amount of loot you can get from other sources, from your Mythic Plus cache, from the raids, more than what we just got an increase from. We just went from 3 items per boss in raids to 4. If you were to basically remove the possibility of gearing up through PvP, you would have to basically increase it even more because you are removing a source of loot altogether because it's just going to work properly in PvP combat only. So I do think it is a pretty good system. Many people, enjoyed the system much more than what we got after that in Legion when we had the supposedly perfect scaling system where everyone had a rather similar power because item level was worth much less. That was supposed to fix everything. It really didn't that much. BFA also didn't do much of anything, much like right now in Shadowlands, where item level is king again. So getting more gear is directly going to make you much more powerful in PvP than in some of the previous expansions without any more limits with things like resilience or importance on versatility. The only thing you need to, make sure of is to have the trinkets for the bonus set, and that's about it. You're ready to go. There is still some importance on versatility to have for PvP, but it's nowhere near, it's nowhere near having higher item level from your gear whenever you enter PvP combat like you used to have. So I do think it's a pretty good solution, but with the current way of things in Shadowlands, there is not enough loot outside of PvP to make this work, so you would have to also increase the overall loot in the other game activities to make this, feasible. The other, the other community crisis was the lack or the no intention from Blizzard of adding customization options for your characters throughout the rest of Shadowlands. We had this type of an announcement all the way back to BlizzCon 2019. That's 2 years ago. Amongst the announcements regarding Shadowlands, the new expansion, one of the keys that was being focused on by Blizzard was the character customization. Was the addition of more freedom and RPG elements on your character. Back then they were showing all the different tattoos and beard styles and hairstyles added for multiple races. Hey, now you can roleplay as a Wild Hammer dwarf or a Sun Fury troll. Hey, look, you can have black character and Asian characters, inclusion for everyone. This was, a big part of the announcement for Shadowlands. As Shadowlands went closer, we had more and more news and more, data mined models and whatnot and options regarding character customization. Hey, look, you can have different colored pupils. Now elves can have leaves in their hair. Look, all these new additional hairstyles, etc., etc. Of course, at the start, a few of these customization options went lacking for a few of the races, particularly the allied races, because the allied races are generally newer than the base models of the base races, but people let it go because they were very excited about all of these new additions to the game. Then there was also the statement from Ion Azikostas pointing out that amongst all of these changes to customization to Shadowlands, there was also the point that this was just an effort that was going to continue after Shadowlands is out the door. So clearly implying some sort of continuation here. So this thing was dropped, just expecting in the future more changes. Except now, in the first bit of important news for the expansion, which is 9.1, we did have the confirmation that there was no more customization options. And then it followed, a whole jargon of PR speech regarding how excited they are about looking in the future and all the different possibilities, and the primary goal is still to making sure that you have new content to play and a series of other things, but no customization options. People, of course, got mad. Some of the things that were let go from the initial announcements, like Nightborn basically being unchanged, Highmont and Tauren basically being unchanged, several of the races being left without hairstyles, and even worse, hair colors, which should ideally take very little to implement, resurfaced as a complaint. Then people started trying to shift the possible faults to things like corporate chain of command, pointing out that actually every one of these changes, even though it looks very simple and it could be done by some rookie Blender user, might even take weeks to pass through all of the people that need to approve this change. And then of course down to the greedy part of the speculation, which is none of this makes you more money, none of this is going to be more revenue for you, so why do we have to spend more time for these type of features? Personally, I don't know. I pull myself out of this. I don't have enough experience in terms of huge AAA companies when it comes to pushing out this type of content. Yes, it looks super simple, but I'm sure they have a whole load of things they have to go over whenever they want to add any one of these changes. It is, at the very least, disingenuous, the part where they did add and mention that the customization options for Shadowlands would have continued throughout the expansion, and this was just, the starting point. And then very abruptly, we can say, just already in 9.1, the first big patch, there is the announcement that they weren't looking for any more changes in the future. This is not like an announcement where there's not going to be a new raid tier or a new raid set, an armor set, something that might take even longer, even more development time. This is something that looks, at the very least on the surface, much faster to be able to implement, right? Draenays have long tails with ornaments on them, and Lightforged Draenays don't. Like, that it doesn't seem a very difficult thing to implement. However, I do feel for people who are very invested in this. Because personally, I don't care, because I never really cared for character customization. I never really see my character is fully armored up. So beyond just the basic animations, that's it. That's all I see of my character. So yeah, to me, it doesn't affect me. But at the same time, since I live by the moral that if something that doesn't affect me can improve the experience of other players in the game, then it should be implemented. In this case, shifting a few more artists to some hairstyles and hair colors and pupil colors and tattoos doesn't seem that big of a deal for my investment and enjoyment of the game, even though I don't care about any of that. But I do know there are plenty of people who do. It was actually very surprising to me how many, casuals or people who just don't do high-level content do actually care about this sort of stuff. Many of the more discussed topics in forums like MMO Champion or just the official forums are about allied races, about customization options, about every sort of made up or extra possible new addition of races and discussions of that sort. So I do sympathize with those people. So I do sympathize with the people who have been let down by this and did wish for better effort, or at the very least more, transparency from Blizzard, since this is what they were expecting at the start of the expansion, and now turns out it's not something that they should be looking forward to, this type of continued effort in the customization of the races. Now on to the last point, possibly a little bit more lighthearted and positive, which is one of the comments made regarding loot in raids. Yes, it's another argument about loot in raids, but this is for something different. One of the many interviews that the many developers in charge of Shadowlands gave out, there was this particular statement from Ian regarding, the previous thing that was already released, regarding the, effort and commitment in adding something new for raiders, because they are doing it for Mythic Plus. You already have a pretty good and well-rewarding system from PvP, so they had one for raiding. They want to implement one from raiding from 9.1. But this statement made me think, because the statement is that the goal for 9.1 is working for cool perks / effects for patch 9.1 raid gear, so that it's the best type of gear to use in raids. I think this is an interesting distinction. It's not the best type of gear to use, which is what usually raid gear has been. It's not even mentioned to be the best type of loot to use in PvE. It's being mentioned as the best type of gear to use in raids. This is very clearly reminiscent of Benthic gear, right? This would be sort of the description you would give Benthic gear. If you were listening or reading to one of the developers telling you about the gear options they had in mind for the Eternal Palace patch, and you knew nothing about it, Benthic gear would kind of resemble this type of description. Now, yeah, Benthic gear was not taken very favorably by the player base now, was it? We have to be honest and say that it wasn't taken favorably because of the socket fiasco, not in and of itself, not the power of the actual effects, more so that it was awful, and the fact that it wasn't even raid loot. It was outside open world activity that you have to grind for mana pearls and then hope for in a lottery to get not only the item you wanted, but then that the item would roll with a socket. So that was the awful part. Would Benthic gear have been as disliked if it was just normal raid loot? I don't think so. This is pretty interesting because if we look at the activities at the end game as two different, very different polar opposites and then a pacifier in the middle. We have PvP all the way to one side and Mythic raiding and raiding in general all the way to the other side. And then you have Mythic Plus in the middle. It is much more likely that PvP players will also be doing Mythic Plus, and it is much more likely that raid players will also be doing Mythic Plus, as opposed to PvP players doing raids and raiders doing PvP. If you exclude the fact that right now they are doing PvP because they want the high item level loot and the way it works right now. So with the idea of making PvP gear scale higher in PvP, you would give PvPers their own type of loot. With the idea of making raid gear better just in raids, you would give raiders their type of loot, and then you would leave Mythic Plus in the middle for everyone to chip in. Especially now that in 9.0.5 it will be able to be upgraded to 220 item level, so being much stronger. You kind of have this system where the best type of loot for both activities, PvP and raids, are specific to the content, and then you have the middle of the pack, the Mythic Plus, that can be used for everything. I think that's a pretty interesting idea. Of course, it all depends on how it is being implemented. Might it simply have a higher item level if it's in a raid? Or is it going to be something similar to Benthic, or even something like the Crucible of Storm gear with some specific effects only working in the specific raid? Now, obviously, we are back to the same problem I mentioned at the start, which was the problem with PvP gear. If you made this happen, then you would have a situation where you do need more loot then. Because if more of your gear that you get from PvP is only going to work in PvP, you will need more loot to offset the fact that now you can no longer count on PvP gear to work in PvE. And if you're making raid gear be much more powerful in raid encounters, but not outside of it or not as much, then you're going to be needing to give out more gear. Because, for example, now PvP players and maybe even Mythic Plus players will have less of a benefit from getting raid gear, so their loot acquisition will slow down. So I actually do think both suggestions are very good and have very good potential. The scaling PvP gear and the raid specific items. At the end of the day, it's not something we ever thought about. There's been a lot of pressure and a lot of ideas regarding keeping PvP gear for PvP, but nobody ever raised their hand and asked, what about raid gear just in raids? It seems so obvious. It seems so clear. It only happened once in the Benthic fiasco, and everyone's idea got soured by the experience of Benthic, but that should just be seen as a black sheep, a failed experiment. I think the actual, properly working version of this Benthic system could actually work very well for raid loot. These were the main discussions I wanted to talk about today. I think they were all pretty interesting points. The one regarding PvP and raid gear is very interesting to discuss. And then the one about the lack of customization in characters coming in the future of Shadowlands is a little bit sad, and there is less to discuss about because it's just Blizzard's decision. There is not much else we can do. Besides, of course, always a possibility, whine and stomp our feet and bitch about it for months until Blizzard inevitably caves in to community pressure and gives us something. So let me guys know what you think about this. I am going to be taking a leave. I have to abandon you. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I have to go and buy myself a new oven.